Okay.
Okay, so as Mark said, I'm Russell Turk. I'm a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University, and I'm the module lead along with Lucy Justice for our first year stats module. Lucy was going to give this talk, but she's unable to be here today, so I'm going to do it on her behalf. Hopefully I'll do a reasonable job of that. So what I'm going to do over the next sort of 20 minutes or so is basically give you an overview of the situation we're in with teaching R, so the sort of context that we're teaching that in, and also the journey that we've taken from when we introduced it through to sort of this year, and then some stuff that we're doing next year. So hopefully I can get this to actually move on. There we go. So start with some background. So Mark has actually been using R in our undergraduate provision for about 10 years. And that started out as a third year elective module and also at MSc. So that's how this sort of the genesis of moving R into our mainstream provision. Then in 2019, 2020, we pushed it through as our default software for all new students. So we started teaching that to around 1,000 first year students back in 2019, 2020, which was a massive undertaking, I'm not going to lie. And then the following year, as those students moved up through the course, we introduced R in year 2. And so then we're teaching to about 2,000 students. And then finally this year, that cohort sort of graduated this year. So they're in their final year. So they're now teaching, or doing all of our stats and research methods teaching with R to around 3,000 students. So when I say, you know, a large department here, that's the scale we're talking about. So cohorts of around 1,000 students. So what I'm going to focus on today is Stats 1, which is our first year stats course. I will sort of talk very briefly about Stats 2 and advanced statistics, but Stats 1 is sort of where students get their first introduction to statistics and to R and RStudio. So for me, that's the real important focus here, not just because it's my module, but because that's where students come in. And if we don't get them there, if we lose them for some reason, then they're unlikely to pick it up in year 2, and they're definitely not going to pick it up in year 3. So it's really key that we try and make our first year provision sort of as good and as smooth as possible for students. And as I say, that has been challenging, and I'll talk about some of those challenges as we go through. But for context, our stats provision in year 1 is taught using a 1-hour lecture and a 1-hour workshop. But R is taught exclusively in those workshops. So we don't do any sort of R teaching or R work in the lectures. That's all theory, statistical theory. So we essentially have an hour a week with students with which to sort of teach them this. And these are students a lot of the time who've got no experience with stats. A lot of them have real anxieties around maths, and learning a new coding language is completely alien to them. Okay? It's not something they wanted to do. So I'm not going to read out all of those topics, but these are the things we cover in year 1, and this links to our research methods. So we have constraints around that, sort of timeframes by which we need to teach certain things so that they know how to do them in research methods. And we currently assess this using a multiple choice exam, which I will talk a little bit about later, but as I'm sure you can imagine, is not the ideal way to assess sort of the application of statistics using R. So very briefly then for Stats 2, Stats 2 uses a similar model to Stats 1 in that they have weekly workshops spread over 14 weeks. They also have some lectures. And we try and adopt this participatory coding approach. So this whole I do, we do, you do type thing. And that works better for some topics than others. The workshops are only an hour long, so larger topics, we don't always get to the sort of you do bit, which is a shame. It's something that we're looking to work on. And then finally, and an honourable mention to advanced stats, which is Mark's baby, his module that he's been running for about 10 years. The reason this is an honorary mention is because this is an elective module. So the students that choose this module know what they're signing up for and they're self-selecting. So they're generally quite good at stats and they're generally quite proficient with R already by the time they take this module. So that's some background as sort of the context in which we're teaching this. So now what I want to do is talk about the stages we went through with Stats 1 and the problems that we encountered at each of these stages. So starting back in 2019, 2020, this is when we introduced R and RStudio as our primary software for teaching stats and for use in research methods. And I think it's safe to say that although we had an idea of what we wanted to do, we had absolutely no idea of what we were doing or what we were letting ourselves in for. Right? We inherited this legacy structure from when we used to use SPSS, which was drop-in workshops every fortnight for stats. And that clearly wasn't going to be enough to introduce students with no stats knowledge, no coding knowledge, none of that, to this new software, to R. So we interleaved those with digital self-taught workshops as well. And this was just really confusing. It was supposed to solve the problem. It didn't. It was just really confusing, and it confused staff, it confused students, because we had to get really creative with our delivery in order to make things match up. Because some students would have their workshop one week, the others would have it the next week. And so not everybody was at the same stage at the same time. We also found that what we lacked was a coherent voice throughout the entire module. And that's something that I'll sort of come back to later, but it's really important, I think, to have this coherency throughout the entire module. So what we had here was different lecturers writing different workshops in their own style, using their own code for the way that they would do whatever, so the way they would run a t-test or the way they would visualize data. And so students were just getting different bits of code thrown at them and being expected to figure it out. And some of that code, particularly for visualization, was quite complex. So moving on to the next year, we thought, okay, this isn't working. So what we're going to do is we're going to have weekly workshops, and we had to push for those. So we got weekly workshops. We thought it's great. We'll get students in. We'll see them every week. And then there was a pandemic. So those weekly workshops went online along with all of our other teaching. And that brought its own problems. So rather than being able to walk over to students in labs, in workshops, and point to their screen and tell them where they're missing a comma or they've got an extra bracket or something like that, we're having to do all of that remotely. And that involves students sharing their screens or trying to describe the problem that they're having. And it turns out that people are not very good at describing what's going wrong. And so this would often derail our workshops. And so we get stuck at the beginning of the workshop trying to solve problems when students hadn't loaded libraries or they couldn't import their data. So things that normally, if you had sort of a teaching assistant or another lecturer in the room, they could go over and solve that problem relatively quickly. We were unable to do that because we were online. So the participatory coding approach, which we were trying to move towards, just wasn't working because it was all falling apart at the beginning as we were trying to get students set up. And we had this lack of coherency still because we were still getting different people to write the different lectures for various workloading reasons. And it was just really difficult to support students. One good thing though that came out of the 2020-2021 delivery is that we developed our own package. So we developed our own R package, which I call SciNTUR. The students, for some reason, called Sinter. I don't know where they got that from, but that's what they call it. And this was Mark's thing. Mark was the driving force behind this. So all credit to him. And what that allows us to do is to simplify some of the code, particularly the visualization code, so students don't have to learn the ggplot sort of language or mini language, as it were, in order to do these things. So we can set up some defaults for them and we can simplify things. And I know there are arguments around whether or not that is a good thing to do, but it has made it possible for us to actually teach, using R to large numbers of students. So for bringing this now right up to date to this academic year just gone, we managed to maintain our weekly workshops, which is great because those are essential. If we don't see students every single week, then we lose them, because we can't rely on them going away and practicing this in their spare time. Obviously, we recommend that, but we can't rely on them doing that. So if we don't see them every week at least, we just lose them. Unfortunately, for various reasons, we had to have our workshops online in term 2. So we thought this was going to be a disaster in term 2. It actually wasn't so bad, because a lot of the early problems that we had, so things like loading packages with library and those kinds of things, students had picked up and become familiar with that in the first term. So those little things that were derailing the workshops during the pandemic were no longer a big issue, because we'd already solved those problems early on. And we were able to adopt a much more effective participatory coding approach. This year as well was the first year where we had one person write all of the workshops. That one person was me. It was a massive amount of work, but it introduced a bit more of a sort of coherency throughout. So we were using the same code throughout, and we were using NTU. So we had this simple code that was so we had continuity, coherency, and that's been really important in getting students sort of comfortable with using R. And we've also started focusing a little bit more on data wrangling, because that was an area that we found students were really struggling with. We used to just give them perfect data, get them to run an ANOVA or a regression using that data. But now what we do is we give them this messy data and we take them through every step of cleaning it, wrangling it, and then running the analysis. So it's much more like doing real data analysis than sort of just doing these problem sets in the thing. And the work on NTU has continued, and we're adding more things to that all the time. So stats 1, our first year stats provision, is a victim of its own success in a way, in that it's forever being chosen to pilot new things. And we are currently the university's flagship module next year for what has been called Hyperflex or HighFlex. And it's a flexible learning model. So students can opt in or out of the workshops every week. And this has been an absolute nightmare. I'm sure Lucy would agree with me that this has been a massive, massive amount of work, and it's been a headache for both of us trying to put this together. On the plus side, though, it has required us to completely redesign how we teach stats and how we teach stats with R. So we're having to prep for this flexible learning. We're having to produce higher quality asynchronous materials, because they have to be able to stand alone if students don't come into the workshops. And we've really sat down and we've gone back to the drawing board and thought about how we get this coherency and this consistency and this scaffolding as we go through. And although this has been a massive job, it's been nice to have the ability to do that rather than just patching the holes sort of as they come up. And we're putting an even larger focus on data wrangling, because data wrangling is one of the biggest things that students do, and we've barely paid it lip service in the past. So that's where we are now. That's where we're going in the future. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I seem to be all right. So I want to talk about the sort of major challenges that we've had, and then I'll talk about a couple of success stories. It's not all doom and gloom. Our biggest challenge teaching R or teaching using R to 3,000 students is basically the scale. Everything we do would work really well, I think, at a smaller scale. But when you sort of you push that out to 1,000 students in one cohort, what we're having labs with 50 or 60 students in, so stats workshops with 50 or 60 students in, and 1 or 2 members of staff. And we just don't have the staff expertise. Staff expertise, I think, is key in this. So a lot of our teaching of statistics and of R falls on a very small number of staff. I think as a department, we have almost 200 academic staff, and we have probably 15 staff who can teach R. And so it's really difficult to deliver this in a consistent manner and support students just when we're at that scale. Everything just becomes so much more difficult at that scale. And although we managed 3 years ago, Mark managed to sort of get the department to buy in to switching to R, there's still a lot of issue, let's say, with staff who don't see why they need to switch. They don't see the relevance of this for them, because SPSS does what they need it to do. They've always used it. They don't want to learn R. They don't have the time to learn. And so we don't have that base of expertise. So as I say, it's falling on a relatively small number of people to support them, to support students, and also to support staff as they learn these things. And as much as staff buy-in is a problem, student buy-in has also been a problem. We draw from quite a diverse population of students, and as I said earlier, we have some with real maths anxiety or stats anxiety. They're not interested in learning coding. They don't feel that they can do it. So there's this lack of sort of agency and self-efficacy. I can't say that one. I don't know why I put it on there. So there's this real lack of them believing they can do it because it's different to anything they've done before. They weren't expecting to have to code when they came to do a psychology degree. And we try and address that. And, we pitch it to them as it's a good thing to do anyway. It gives them all these tools for employability. It's a real boon for them. They can go on and they can do data analysis jobs and things like that. But it's a hard sell with a lot of students. That's not to say that some of our students don't buy into it, right? Some really do, but there are a lot that don't. And then when we were talking about the assessment earlier, we've got this legacy assessment, which is this multiple choice exam, and trying to assess their proficiency with using R in a multiple choice exam is difficult. So it can be done, but it's difficult and it requires some sort of thinking. So we're actually looking in future, over the next couple of years, to introduce a practical element to the module as well, a practical assessed element. We were going to do that this year, but with the hyperflex and things like that, that's been put on hold until we can evaluate the effectiveness of hyperflex. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like yet, but it is something that we have in the pipeline. And then I'll finish on a sort of a positive note. So with our success stories, as I said, NTU is probably one of our biggest success stories here. It's allowed us to simplify some of the more complex code, standardize the syntax. So the syntax that we've got for histograms, for scatter plots, for box plots is pretty much the same, right? It's pretty much the same syntax. So once students get the hang of that, sort of that standardized syntax, it makes it much easier for them to pick up the new things. So we're not having to teach everything from scratch, and we're scaffolding, through the use of that standardization. And final year projects, although we've had, and I focus a lot on some of the problems we've had here, but actually we've managed to get roughly 1,000 students to a point where they can and have analyzed data as part of their project. And so we've taken people who had absolutely no experience using R, given them around 30 hours of teaching over 2 years and got them to a point, where they can do this or more or less independently. And I think that in itself is a massive achievement. And as I say, we are more or less successfully delivering now to around 3,000 students. And we get very few sort of serious problems or serious issues. It's a minority of students who just don't get it in the end. So that is, I appreciate that's a relatively whistle-stop tour of our stats provision and the journey so far. I see there's a couple of questions in the chat that Mark has kind of
so Russell, I wasn't aware if you were seeing those chat questions as well, but I wasn't trying to answer for you. I just didn't know if you were seeing them. But you can also answer those questions as well, and anybody else who has any further questions.
Yeah, so you know the answers anyway, Mark. So I just I'll deal with those questions in the chat, and then I'll come here. So would I say that student buy-in is lower than for SPSS? No, not really. There have always been students who just don't want to do stats. I think the difference is that we need the buy-in more when we're teaching using R, because with SPSS, you can kind of muddle your way through it with a guide. It's a lot harder to do that with R. They really need to know what they're doing. So I'd say, although the buy-in is probably about the same, it has a bigger effect with R.
So, Russell, in case you didn't see it, there was another question there just about, whether stats 1 was one term or both, and that's been answered there. But so let me try to organize some of the questions in chats for you. And then there's some people as well who've raised their hands. We'll get to you in just a second. We've plenty of time for questions, fortunately.
Okay, well, if you want to just throw those questions out for me then, Mark. And
absolutely, yeah. So Emma has a question in chat here. How long is the advanced level 6 module? Oh, that's my module, so I'll answer that. That's a first term, that's a 1-term module, but it's an intensive 1-term module. It's sorry, let me turn on my video here. It's 40 contact hours. It's 4 hours per week for 10 weeks. And Tom Beasley has a question for you, Russell. How do you provide support for final year projects? At Lancaster, we are preparing for our first year. For our first year of doing this, I see you have 4 times the number of students. What tips do you have? Yeah, that's a very good question. Do you want to address that, Russell?
Yeah, so support comes from, our final year students are organized into project labs. So there are 2 members of staff in that lab with around 16 students. And it is the responsibility of those staff members to support those students with the stats and with using R. We do have, we've got a staff teams page with a lot of resources in supporting staff to do that. So as a teaching team, we don't support the project students directly. And that's to do with sort of parity and things like that. What we do is we support the lecturers in supporting their students. We would hope that by the time they've done 2 years of stats, the students have enough of a knowledge that the support that staff members have to provide them is relatively sort of light touch. I say, but that really does vary by student.
Okay. Great. So there's quite a few questions coming into chat, and if I don't get to all of them, if I don't see them all now, that's not to say that I'm not ignoring them, and it's not to say that you can't ask those questions later, where we will have a general discussion. So if the question that you're raising now isn't being addressed now, please raise it again later in the general discussion, where we just want people to ask questions on anything, maybe specifically to do with some talks or just general topics. So there was a question there about, do your psychology students have any mathematical requirements upon entry to university? And
I believe the answer is no.
That's right.
We have, obviously we have standard sort of entry tariffs, but maths is not a requirement.
That is right. I do not believe it is. And so there was a question which I think is a very important question, but I hope it comes up again later in the discussion. And that was just about the motivation to switch if so few staff are proficient or users. This is a difficult one, because I think that there's different levels of proficiency. I think, and so there's a small number with, I think, expert levels, and then a larger number with familiarity. But so I don't know, Russell, do you want to say something about that? Personally, I would like, if that discussion came up again, if that topic came up again later in the discussion. But if you want to say something about that.
I think that's a bigger discussion. But yeah, when I said that we probably got around 15 staff members who can teach R. But all of our staff members are expected to be able to support students. It's just a lot of our staff don't have the proficiency, as Mark was saying, to deliver the sessions. So a lot of that falls on a small number. As for sort of why switch, and it really comes down to the fact that SPSS is, well, it's not used outside of social psychology departments. So if we're trying to prepare our students for work, it makes absolute sense to give them the tools that they can use when they go out into the real world. SPSS just doesn't do that. And for a lot of students, that might be fine. They might not want to do any statistical analysis in their careers at all. They probably never want to see stats again. Right? But we're at least giving them that option. And so it's a more flexible tool. It's something that they can use. It's open source. So, you know, there are cost implications, although the university still uses it elsewhere, so they've not taken advantage of those. But yeah, so that was the real, I think, the main sort of reasons for switching.
Yeah, so it's a big topic. We honestly debated it for years. It was a departmental wide debate that went on for nearly 2 years, and a lot of people had a lot to say on it. So there's a lot to discuss there. So let me turn to the two people who raised their hands. Apologies for waiting. And so we've got Kai Longman. Are you there?
I am. Hi.
Hi.
That was really interesting, Russell. Thank you. I have one really quick question that I hope you can answer for me, but I wanted to ask you a second more important one. The first one is it sounded, the way you were describing it, it sounded like the teaching of R is done separately to research methods. Is it actually a separate module entirely?
Yes.
Where you do stats in R, and you also have a research methods module?
Yes, so our first year students have that dedicated stats module, and then they also have 2-hour research methods labs.
Previously, would you have then done the sort of SPSS work in the research methods module? So you've created a brand new...
No, so they've always had this dedicated stats teaching, but at least for as long as I've known. All we've done really is we've doubled the number of workshops, because once a fortnight drop-in workshops just wasn't sufficient.
Sure. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. But I was more interested really in the NTUR package. The way you pitched it, it sounded like it was kind of a really central and almost essential aspect of rolling out, especially with such a huge cohort each year. So I'm wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about that, how essential it is in order to start teaching R. And also, like, I'm not sure that there's anyone in our department who would be able to program a new package in R like that. So even using your package might be helpful, but like, it sounds like it would be nice to be able to tailor something specifically to what you use in your department and whatever, but I wouldn't be able to do that. So would I struggle to teach R without NTUR, or without developing my own package? And yeah, hi Andy.
So that the first year that we introduced it, we taught without it. So it is possible to do it. It's just that, so there were a lot of issues that we had, around the introduction. And SciNTUR was one of the sort of solutions that we came to. And to be honest, I couldn't program that package, right? This is almost primarily Mark. So Mark's programmed this package. He'd be better to talk to you about that kind of thing. I would say it's not essential, but given the numbers of students we have, the simpler we can make things, the better. I mean, I had reservations about it to start with, because the more you take things away from doing things properly, as it were, the more you simplify things, do you get to a point where you're not actually teaching students to use R? You're just giving them these bits of code to copy. And we try not to do that. And I think the big thing that SciNTUR allows us to do is to teach the elements of the code. So we can teach which bit is the data, which bit is the variables, and which each bit's doing, because it's simpler. If we were teaching using, say, ggplot, right, we would just be giving them code to copy. We'd be basically just going, and then you just need to add this bit here to do this, and we wouldn't have time or the capacity to teach every little bit. Something like ggplot, you need to teach them the language so that they understand what they're doing, and we just don't have the capacity for that with one primary member of staff in a workshop with 50 students, with perhaps a PhD student supporting. So for us, it's been a godsend. If you had a smaller number of students, I'd say it was absolutely possible to teach without it. And I say Mark has shared a link in the chat to the SciNTUR package. It is on, I believe it's pronounced CRAN, isn't it, Mark, rather than CRAN?
Oh, I say CRAN, but yeah. So I gave a link to a website there, but Tom Beasley just pointed out, and I think this is probably most important for anyone who's interested in just this general topic. So we did have a talk on this last year at this symposium last year, and that's on YouTube. So if you are interested in the topic of this package, why we developed it, what use is it, is it any use, is it necessary, hopefully that talk will be useful to you. So I want to wrap up now, but before I do that, I want to turn to Tamara, who has been waiting very patiently for many minutes to ask her question. So are you there, Tamara?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much for allowing me to ask a question. And thanks,
Sure.
Russell, for the talk. I thought it was really interesting, because at Leicester we also kind of look at introducing this to undergraduates. And because of that, I have two very practical questions. I mean, two questions about the practical implications of the teaching. So I was wondering, with the when you start in the first year, you said that you have MCQs for assessing, the stats stuff. And are these MCQs kind of targeted at assessing both their stats understanding and their skills with R, or are they only looking at the stats? So I can ask both questions now and just kind of shut up afterwards. And the second question has to do with dissertation. I understand that you've started this journey in 2019, right? The 2019-2020.
Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, you already have dissertation students by now that have gone through R, the whole. So since you mentioned that, it's a normal problem, there's a small pool of staff that would be able to kind of teach R. I wonder, how was the relationship between the students and their supervisor for working on their dissertations? Did they use R, or did they just go for help to, the 50 members of staff that are able to teach R? How was that managed generally?
Okay, so I'll answer the first one first. And it's nice to see you again.
Very nice to see you too, and I'm glad you're doing this stuff at the NTU, because I know how passionate you are about it.
Yeah. But so the MCQ, around 75% of it is stats theory, and around 25% of it is sort of things like picking the correct R codes to produce a plot. So there are several different ways to do it, but around 25% of it is about R. The second one about staff and student relationships is always a tricky one. So it really depends on the staff member. So if the staff member says to the student, I can't help you, right? I don't know how to do that, then the relationship sours, as it would if the staff member said that they couldn't help them with anything. That doesn't happen very often, okay, barely at all, you know. In which case students then go to the dissertational project module lead, and it gets arbitrated that way. What they can't do is that students can't come to one of the stats teaching team and ask their questions, because what we don't want to do is undermine that relationship between the student and the supervisor. And if you've got students going behind their supervisor's back to talk to somebody from the stats team who's giving them some advice, and then that doesn't match with what the supervisor's told them, it's just a mess. So yes, we avoid that. And what we do is, if a student goes to a supervisor and asks a question they don't know the answer to, the supervisor's response should be, okay, I don't know how to do that, but I will find out for you. And then they can come to us, or they can go to the resources, and we will provide that help for them.
Thank you so much. And just to clarify, so they do use our stats for their dissertation projects, right? Rather than what their supervisors,
Yes.
recommend. Okay,
So,
thank you.
So we do allow for supervisors to use different software. We always have. Some supervisors used R when we were teaching SPSS. It doesn't make a lot of sense for supervisors to do that, because you have to reteach students. You have to teach them this new software. So not many supervisors do. I think we've got one or two who use JASP. So it does happen, but yeah, primarily students use R for their projects.
Okay, so I'm going to call it a day on your talk now. Let me just stop the recording.